And then I looked on my shoulder, and she stood up. She saw us. She stood up and was running around his carcass, and she woke up triplets. The most dangerous time to be near a grizzly bear is when she has cubs, and the second most dangerous time is when there's a carcass there. So there's some sort of a geometric progression on this. It was not a good place to be. So she's running around this carcass. So now I could have kept going, but I thought, no, I'm just going to stay here and see what happens. And so I stopped and get down, try to look small and non-threatening. And she stands on the carcass on her hind legs, huffing and popping her jaws, swaying back and forth, really agitated. And I thought, this is going to hurt if she comes at us. So while I was waiting to see if it was hurt, I took a couple of photographs of her standing on this carcass. And then she drops on all fours and comes running at us full blast. The three little cubs racing after her, trying to keep up. And I thought, this is going to hurt a lot. So I stand up now, and Bob, to his great credit, stood right beside me. He didn't take off running like my friends in Alaska. And she comes blasting through the sage. She gets to about 50 yards, and I figured about 20 yards, I'm going to drop down, cover up my neck, and curl up and hope she chews on Bob instead of me.
Welcome to Whiskey to Map, stories of adventure and exploration as told by those who live them. In this episode, we are joined by award-winning wildlife photographer Tom Murphy as he shares stories of facing down mountain gorillas, encounters with grizzly bears, and his epic solo crossing of Yellowstone National Park in the winter. Tom, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, too. You are a famous wildlife photographer, numerous awards, but there's one series of photographs and wildlife encounters I'd really like to start off with, and that is your encounters with the mountain gorillas. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, mountain gorilla is my favorite animal I've ever encountered in the world. I love bison and other animals too, but the mountain gorillas in Central Africa captured me. I first went to Zaire in 1992 and went into Zaire, which is now called the Republic of Congo. Too dangerous to go in there now, they tell me. Most of my experiences have been in Rwanda since, but the ones in Zaire, the 3 days that I first met them, basically, were in Zaire. And in Zaire as well as Rwanda right now, you pay so much a day to go see the gorillas, and you have 1 hour. Once you make visual contact, they start the clock and you have to go away after an hour. And so we left the first morning, and the introduction said, when they charge, don't run. I didn't think about that too much, so it wasn't if, it was when.
It wasn't if, it's when. So when this happens.
Yeah. Right. So they didn't have a real organized setup at the time, and so we had real trackers. They saw them the day before. They went to the place where they'd last seen them, and with machetes, about 6 of these small pygmy men, hacking their way through the jungle, following them along, finding their day beds. Really cool. Getting into finding a different family group. Now, the silverback male, one of his main jobs is protecting the family. So you have to get past him before you can even see the rest of them. And his first response to us was myself, a guide, one of my friends, and then these 6 pygmy men. And as soon as he saw us, he comes screaming at us. And I jumped behind the guide. I didn't run, but I jumped behind the guide. And they're about 500 or 600 pounds. They're bigger than a Yellowstone grizzly bear. Their heads are like huge, big canine teeth. And they come screaming up at you, throwing rocks and dirt and sticks. And he charged us every time we made visual contact. He charged and he'd go away, and then we'd kind of get our hearts going again, and we'd follow him again. And so at that first day, he charged us like 12 times in the first 30 minutes. The last time he charged us, he came running up at us, like within arm's length away. And I wasn't jumped behind the guide by that time. I was able to stand still. And he ran down the row of us, pygmy men were shaking their machetes at him, which I didn't think was a good idea. And he pulls his tree out of the ground, this live tree, slams it on the ground and says, if this was your neck, that's what I would do. We left. And then the next day I had a different guide and went to a different family group. And we're also charged right away. We had to wade through waist deep bogs and crawl around. I mean, it was really the tracking part was also cool. And once we made visual contact with this family, immediately we were charged. But they calmed down fairly quickly. The guide on the second day had a technique that I wished I'd have known about the first day. You sounds, and you pat your chest. You don't beat your chest, you just pat your chest. And they calm down. I'd have been doing that the first day, but so this guy was much better. And so there's a silverback male, the dominant one, and then there's a younger one who was also big. It was a silverback, but not the dominant one. He was missing the 3 fingers on his, I can't remember, right hand or left hand. I can't remember which hand. He got caught in a snare when he was a little bitty guy. And they get caught in these snares, and when they're small, they can't get loose. They either starve to death or they basically stay there until their fingers die and they can get away. So he survived this, but he lost his 3 fingers. And they called him Pork Chop. And really cool gorilla. So we got into the whole family. The silverback male dominant one calmed down, and he was up in this tree, big tree, going after these nuts or whatever, about the size of a golf ball. And he'd go up in this tree and he'd just jump up and down on this big branch until it broke, and bam, he'd fall on the ground. Then he'd just pick him off the branch. So while he was doing this, there wasn't enough light to do photography at the time. It was too dim. Film wasn't that good at the time. So I'm sitting on this log watching him and this family, and Pork Chop comes up, sits right beside me on the log, puts his hand on my leg, and looks at me like right here. And I'm thinking, this is really scary, but it's really cool because I've been charged a bunch of times and threatened to kill you. And he lost interest and got up and walked away. And a couple of those kind of experiences that first 3 days I had. Again, I didn't get any photographs of any value at the time, but these are really cool. You look in their eyes, they're very intelligent. They're primarily vegetarians, even though they've got giant canine teeth. And so I went back into Rwanda 4 different times on different trips. And not being charged very many times, but I've had all these interactions with family groups. My favorite single interaction was in Rwanda, probably 10 years ago, I guess, 8 years ago. And interaction between an animal and its environment or other animals is the best wildlife photographs. Portrait stuff is great, but what do they do? How do they make a living? What's it like to be this mountain gorilla? And my all-time favorite photograph of mountain gorilla is a mom holding her 5-week-old baby, this tiny little miniature gorilla, kissing each other, stroking each other's faces. And so they probably did this for about 10 minutes, and I didn't even look at anything else. There was this big male behind me yelling and screaming. I didn't even look. I was so concentrating on this little baby gorilla and his mom. And I think if people treated each other this well, we'd be a lot better off.
Your outdoor skills, I imagine you acquired them very young, growing up on a ranch. Can you tell us about growing up on that ranch?
Yeah, it's I spent 20 years on a cattle ranch, a 7,500 acre grassland beef cattle ranch, what my dad raised in western South Dakota. If anybody's been to Badlands National Park in South Dakota and seen Wall Drug, famous tacky tourist place, our ranch we can see the lights of Wall from our ranch. Oh, the middle of nowhere. The nearest grocery store is in Sturgis, South Dakota, which is 60 miles away one way. So it was an isolated place. So what we did, Dad raised beef cattle, and I grew up in the back end of a 51 Chevrolet pickup and 2-wheel drive. So we got stuck a lot. And so I'm pretty good at getting around because I know what it's like to be stuck. How do you avoid that? So being, the oldest boy, well, I was basically my dad's hired help. And so I was on foot a lot. I rode horseback when I had to go quite a ways. So I don't really like cows or horses because of that, because they always meant work. But one of the things about riding horseback, if snow's too deep or too muddy or whatever, you get on a horse, they can get around a lot better. But if it's 30 below zero, it's really miserable sitting on top of a horse. None of that heat from the horse comes up to you. So I usually prefer to walk. And so that's kind of one of the things that kind of, I think, trained me to be a wildlife photographer. I'm comfortable with being outside and working outside, walking and climbing and moving around a lot. So that's one of the skills I think I accidentally learned, I guess. So on the ranch, I learned behavior about ungulates, cows, and being around horses. We had a pet dog and chickens and whatever. And of course, there was other animals like prairie dogs and badgers. I tried to make an adult badger a pet one time. He wasn't interested. And finally, he turned around at me and growled at me, and I realized he was telling me to go away, which I finally did. And anyway, so I was always curious about birds. They were all around me, and what do they do? I like sharp-tailed grouse. They on our ranch we have what they call leks, which are dancing grounds. It's a mating ritual where they really cool. They little bitty grouse, a little smaller than a normal chicken, and they in the spring, like probably early April, they get on. They collect on these grassland areas and flat prairie flat plateaus on our ranch, and you might have 50 of them, and the males run around and stick their little tail up in the air, fill up this what they call a tympanic membrane, and make this really cool little sound, kind of a grunting sound, and then they tap their feet on the dirt, and you can hear them in the still mornings. You could hear them from our ranch house like a mile or 2 miles away, and this little oop 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 sound, and my grandmother told me when she first homesteaded this part of this ranch, which would have been about 1910, 1912, the market hunting was still a factor. And she said they used to come up from the Badlands area, south of our ranch, and kill grouse by the wagon load and take them and sell them to restaurants. And so we were lucky to see 50 birds, but they would apparently come and kill hundreds of birds at a time. And so that's kind of one of the things that has always driven me into a certain extent about wildlife photography is I grew up with some wildlife, but I was attracted to, still am, to places that have lots of wildlife. That's one of the things I really like about Yellowstone. There used to be grizzly bears, wolves, elk, bison by the hundreds of thousands that went across our ranch. They're all gone, but they're still in Yellowstone Park. So I try to get a sense of what it might have been like on our ranch at one time when there would be, herd of 10,000 bison. It's kind of an interesting concept, but cows aren't nearly as interesting from my standpoint as bison are. So again, I'm trying to, in a sense, trying to understand animals from a little experience I had as a kid. And bison act a lot like cattle, or vice versa. Wildebeest in Africa, I see some similarities there, herd behaviors, and so it's a combination of what I sort of accidentally learned and find out it's sort of relevant to my job now.
You were speaking of grizzly bears. My understanding is you've had a few close encounters with them. Can you tell us about those?
Well, I've probably had maybe 1,000 grizzly bear encounters from Alaska, Canada, all the way to the Tetons, and been charged 3 times. And this is before bear spray was a popular thing. I carry bear spray now, mostly for the bears' protection. I've never used it, but some friends have used it, and it'll knock them to the ground. A friend of mine, Tim Cahill, sprayed me with bear spray one time. He claims it was an accident, but I think it might have been intentional just to see what my response was. It wasn't good. It hurts like crazy. And even getting it on your skin, it's like having a really bad sunburn. I mean, it's oil-based. You can't really wash it off with water. So you just kind of stagger around until it goes away. So if you hit a bear, two things happen. My friend's experience, it'll knock them down and they'll run away. And so you prevent them from creating a problem, you getting hurt, and somebody wanting to kill the bear. But the second thing is they're less likely to charge somebody the next time they see somebody, because the last time it hurt like crazy. So anyway, this is all before bear spray. I was in Katmai in Alaska, Katmai National Park. I teach photography, and I had 4 students behind me. We're walking on a trail into one of these stands near Brooks Falls. And we're the first ones in the morning, and bears everywhere. And so you talk, make noise so they know you're coming. You don't wake somebody up. So I'm talking for a while, and pretty soon you get tired of, yelling, "Hey, bear." So I was walking along quietly. My 4 people behind me come around this little corner into an open area of grass, and here comes this grizzly sow, as it turns out, running up the hill at me. I rarely hear them growl. What they do generally, if they're upset, is they huff when they're really loud and pop their teeth together, snap their teeth, which is a pretty scary sound. So here she comes running up through the grass, and I had a tripod with my big lens over one shoulder, and so I put my other arm in the air, try to look tall, and start to back up slowly. And my 4 students took off running like a bunch of quail. They're gone. They disappeared. Brush. The trees
Thanks for the support.
I know, you're supposed to stand side by side and look like one big thing. So they're gone. And so here she comes. And so I probably back up. It happened really fast. Probably didn't last more than 15 seconds total. And she veered off about 15, 20 feet in front of me and went on and disappeared into the grass again. So I turn around, look for my friends who are all, I couldn't find them. They were hiding in the trees. So that was, they broke the rules there for me. And then I was in Hayden Valley in Yellowstone one time with a guy from Brooklyn who is a lawyer, high-powered lawyer in Washington, D.C., named Bob Bennett. And I'd met him at a party here in Livingston, and he said Yellowstone was just a bunch of Winnebago bumpers. And I said, well, you need to get off the road. So took him into the backcountry going west from the road in Hayden Valley in August, which is during the bison rut. Again, I love bison. And looking for whatever. I don't really generally make plans for any kind of what I'm going to shoot unless I'm going to a kill or a nest or something. But there's always something out there. So be open to anything. So we're back about 2 miles from the road heading west, in this open grassland, and come over this little rise, and off to our left, there's a dead bison, a big bull bison carcass. And we're about 50 yards away from this carcass. I walked this all off later. And first thing I think of is where there's a bear around there. And I suspect the bison was probably killed by another bison during a fight, which happens quite often. So I stopped, talked to Bob, and I said, point out this carcass. And he got a pair of binoculars, and he was from Brooklyn. He wasn't very good with binoculars. And finally found the carcass. And I said, there's probably killed by another bison, et cetera, et cetera. I was not going to that carcass unless there was 47 people or something. And so we kind of went off to the left, to the right, and take about 5 steps. And then this grizzly bear's head pops up. She's in the belly of this bison, feeding on the bison carcass, but she was looking into the bison. She didn't see us. And I said, Bob, we got to get out of here. So he gets his binoculars out, and I say, no, we got to get out of here. So I get him turned around, and we start walking directly away from this carcass. And I was heading for a herd of bison. I'm not afraid of bison. I can walk into a herd of bison. And so I'm ahead trying to go as fast as I could. He stopped and got his binoculars out again. So I grab him and turn him around, and we got about 110 yards away. And then I looked on my shoulder, and she stood up. She saw us. She stood up and was running around this carcass, and she woke up triplets. So the most dangerous time to be near a grizzly bear is when she has cubs, and the second most dangerous time is when there's a carcass there. So there's some sort of a geometric progression on this. It was not a good place to be. So she's running around this carcass. So now I could have kept going, but I thought, no, I'm just going to stay here and see what happens. And so I stop and get down, try to look small and non-threatening. And she stands on the carcass on her hind legs, huffing and popping her jaws, swaying back and forth, really agitated. And I thought, this is going to hurt if she comes at us. So while I was waiting to see if it was hurt, I took a couple of photographs of her standing on this carcass. And then she drops on all fours and comes running at us full blast. The three little cubs racing after her, trying to keep up. And I thought, this is going to hurt a lot. So I stand up now, and Bob, to his great credit, stood right beside me. He didn't take off running like my friends in Alaska. And she comes blasting through the sage, and she gets to about 50 yards, and I figured about 20 yards, I'm going to drop down, cover up my neck, and curl up and hope she chews on Bob instead of me. So I don't know what Bob was thinking.
He was thinking the same thing. I hope he was chewing on you.
I'm sure this never happened to him in Brooklyn either. But right about then, about 50 yards away, she spun around, ran over the cubs, and went back past the carcass, cubs chasing after her, and went over the hill. So we got our hearts going again and walked on. And we had lunch later, and he said, "What would you have done if I hadn't been there?" And I said, "I'd have gotten a lot further away," because he kept stopping and looking with his binoculars. And he said, "You mean I almost got us killed?" And I said, "Well, yeah, you did, actually." But he was one of Bill Clinton's lawyers at the time. And so Bob bought a couple of prints for me. He said he has a copy of this photograph of this grizzly on a carcass standing on his hind legs, popping his jaws, and the three little cubs. And he put it on his wall in his office. And he said he put a plaque on the bottom. It says, "I stared down this grizzly, so I'm not afraid of you," which is partially true. And then he gave a copy of it to Bill Clinton. And he said, when Bill Clinton saw this photograph, he said, "That's what the press looks like to me." Aggressive grizzly bear, yeah. So anyway, impressive.
You have to have huevos of stone to be, staring down grizzlies chasing after you, silverback gorillas coming charging at you, or sitting right next to you. Just, I got to hand it to you. It's, I guess, growing up on that ranch, cool under pressure.
Yeah.
You took a remarkable solo trip across Yellowstone in the wintertime, I believe. Mm-hmm. And it's a heck of an accomplishment. I mean, that area in the wintertime is harsh. Can you tell us about that trip?
I skied most of the way across the park east to west in 1981. Went a third of the way into the trip. I had a partner, and he quit and went home, and I went on by myself. So I had a little experience. Again, I'm comfortable with being outside in the cold. I don't want to be on a horse. I'm fine on the ground. Like the last winter I was on the ranch, we had a storm, 3-day storm, where it was 45 below zero with a 40-mile-an-hour wind. That's a wind chill of about 80 to 90 degrees below zero. And I've read that 90 below zero will freeze put ice crystals in exposed skin within 2 minutes. I mean, it's extremely cold. So I had to feed cattle. My dad had a seniority, so he laid by the stove. Nothing would start. Pickups, tractors, nothing would start. So I had to walk on foot to feed these cattle and also cut ice off so they could drink. So I left the house, got up on this ridge, trying to look into the wind, and my eyes froze shut. Tear up, and my eyelashes froze together. So I had to walk backwards for 1.5 miles to get to these cattle to take care of these, get water to them and feed them. So I'm not afraid of cold. And, I wore every piece of clothing I had. So when I look forward to this, planning this trip, I was going to ski from the south entrance, Flag Ranch, to the south entrance and then head east along the boundary to the thoroughfare, which is the southeast corner of Yellowstone Park. There's a backcountry patrol cabin there that I don't have access to. That's Park Service stuff. But that building is the most isolated, occupied building in the United States outside of Alaska. It's called the Thoroughfare Patrol Cabin. So it's the most remote spot in the lower 48 states. So I was skiing there. I talked to a friend of mine afterwards, a ranger, and he said I was the only person to ski in there for 10 years. I mean, almost nobody goes in there in the summertime either. So I knew what I was going into, and I wasn't afraid of cold, like I said. So in the summer of 1984, I asked some people if they would join me for this trip, and I had 6 people that said they would. Tim Cahill was one of them, and he bailed out. He came to his senses. One guy broke his arm. I think he did it on purpose. And they all found reasons not to go. Because I was going to go from the south entrance into the thoroughfare and all the way north to Mammoth. And so one guy stayed with me. So we would go up into the park about 2 or 3 times a week in December, January, February to get in shape. I carried about a 35-pound pack and we skied all day. So the night before we're supposed to leave, he calls, we packed everything up and in 2 packs, the tent and whatever, all the food, white gas to melt snow for drinking water, and supposed to pick him up at 8 o'clock the next morning. At 7:30, he called me and said he couldn't go because his dog was sick. I don't know what he fed his dog, but he chickened out. And so I figured, well, I've committed myself, sort of like getting in this airplane or running into a bison or a grizzly bear. I said, I'll do it. I'm not afraid of getting cold, and I know my way around. So Bonnie, my wife, and I drove around to Jackson, spent the night before in Jackson. We drove to Flag Ranch, which is the closest you can get to the south entrance, the closest they plow the road. Got out, skied the road for 3 miles to get a backcountry permit at the south entrance, which the park wants to know about where you think you're going to be and when you're going to be out, think you're going to come out. So if you don't come out, they have some idea where to look for you. So I got the permit. And the first and only time the ranger ever said, would you call me when you get out? Because you're not supposed to do this by yourself. So I headed east along the south boundary of the park. And my first obstacle is the Snake River. And there's no bridge there. And I knew there was no ice on this river because there's some thermals about 5-6 miles upstream, Snake River Hot Springs. And so I knew this, so I brought a pair of wool socks, not for warmth, but for traction to wade across this river. Round rocks about the size of your head, covered with moss, they're really slippery. So I get up to the edge of the river, and it's 5 degrees, 5 above zero, which is still pretty chilly. Take off my clothes. I'm naked from the waist down because I didn't want to get my clothes wet. And I put these wool socks on and tie everything on my pack, including my skis, leave my waist belt unbuckled in case I fell down. I can't swim, by the way. And use my ski poles to help balance a little bit, and I wade across the river. It's about knee deep, fast, really hard on your feet because you jam your toes into the next rock, and it's a really miserable thing to do. Got to the other side, pitched my pack into the snow, and stomped out a place on the snowbank to get dressed again. Now I'm putting on warm, dry clothes. That's why I took them off. I laid these socks on the snowbank. They immediately froze solid. I mean, it's 5 degrees. That's colder than your freezer that's in your house. And put on my clothes, put on my skis, and tied these frozen socks on my pack and took off skiing to warm up because my feet were numb and I was cold. And I made it about 30 yards, and I found out I was on an island. I hate it when that happens because no matter which way I go, I got to do this again. So I had to, it turns out the main river was still ahead of me. I'd only crossed a small part of it. So I went to the river, again, took off my clothes, had to dip these frozen socks into the river to loosen them up so I could put these frozen socks back on again. And the second crossing was waist deep. I was just about floating. And, of course, I wanted my pack waist belt off or unbuckled so I could get rid of that pack if I fell down. And so I got to the other side, and so that was my first morning. Was a little more excitement than I planned. But I went on.
Well, you talk about excitement. You know, that was incredibly dangerous from the aspect of if you slipped and not getting hurt in the water, but all of your gear and clothes getting wet, you're in a world of hurt if that happens.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so to a certain extent, I wasn't quite as dangerous there because I was only like a mile from the ranger station. So I could have run there naked, basically and get to him. But I did a couple other crossings of the Yellowstone River that was more dangerous than this, because if I'd fallen into the Yellowstone River, I crossed on about an inch of ice on the Yellowstone River above the lake. And if I'd fallen in through that ice, I was done. There's no way I was going to get back out of that. But again, I figured I could make it once I committed myself. And so I did it was 14 days. It stormed for 12 of the 14 days. I had 2 sunny days the entire trip. And my average nighttime temperatures, I had a pretty accurate little thermometer on my zipper, was between 25 and 35 below zero. And again, I'd comfortable with, or not comfortable, I've survived in 80 below zero wind chill. So it was cold, but I knew I could do it. So when we split our packs up when that guy bailed out, I threw the tent away because I wasn't going to carry that weight. So I traveled with a little light blue tarp, about as thick as a napkin. So what I do, what keeps me alive is a 3-pound down sleeping bag. So it's generally rated, most of the 3-pound bags are rated to 20 below zero. Now I've slept comfortably at 35 below zero in that bag, uncomfortably at 45 below zero. I got a little cold at 45 below zero. But I basically, my little tarp, 6 foot square, put a third of it on the snow after I stomped the snow down, tie it up between 2 trees. So a third of it's on the snow, a third of it has a wall, a third of it has a roof. And mostly it's not for warmth, but it's mostly to keep the snow off my face. Prickly snow wakes me up, cold snowflakes hitting my face. And I sleep really well, working really hard. Carrying a 70-pound pack, breaking my own trail. I probably snowed between 3 and 4 feet cumulatively on me during that trip. So I'm sometimes breaking 2.5 feet of powder. And every foot of it, I had to break trail. I didn't share it with anybody. And I lost 18 pounds in 14 days.
Wow.
Nutritionists tell me that I was probably burning between 10 and 12,000 calories a day. And normally you live on about 2,000 calories and comfortably. So I can't eat that much food. I love chocolate, but I can't eat 10,000 calories worth of chocolate.
No.
So one of the big jobs was melting snow for drinking water. If you could, in open water, I'd fill up my water bottles and drink as much as I could. But most of the time you couldn't get at it. If it was 35 below zero, everything pretty much freezes. So that's kind of a miserable job, stuffing snow in a little tiny pot to melt snow for water. But probably the most uncomfortable thing was, again, I slept great in this sleeping bag, but at the time I had these little narrow metal edge skis, Europa 99s, if you're familiar with those backcountry skis. And now I buy them as long as they make them and as wide as they make them for flotation. And I had just boots I had with these fairly light leather shoes, just single, not a double boot, just a single boot. And I waterproofed them really well before I left. But my feet are down in this powder all the time. I generally almost never could see my feet. And they were soaking wet after about 3 days. I mean, I could literally squeeze water out of them. And so what do I do these things at night? I don't want them in my sleeping bag because then my sleeping bag gets wet. So between my sleeping bag and the back wall of this little tarp, I put them in there so they wouldn't get buried in the snow, so I wouldn't lose them overnight to get covered with snow. but I had to make sure the laces were loose, and and the tongue was way up because the next morning they're frozen solid. So I get up, put these frozen shoes on. Of course, I can't lace them shut because they're frozen open now. So then I couldn't go anywhere in 10 feet of snow without skis. So I put these shoes on, put my shoes on, boots on, get on my skis, and ski around in circles for about 10 minutes till my feet thawed out the shoe. Then I'd lace my shoes shut, and then my feet were cold, of course. I'd ski around for another 10 minutes till my feet warmed up, and then that was my morning ritual before I put away my camp. So that usually discourages anybody from joining me on these trips. Mostly, I've done about 45 backcountry trips, and there's only, I can count them on one hand, the people who've actually done it twice. They go once, and that's it. They're done with that. So one of the things...
What did you see along the way?
Yeah, good question. What I see, that's the reason I did all these trips, is I want to see the country in the wintertime, and I want to understand what it's like for animals out there. They'd have to sleep in the snow every night. So what I saw on this solo trip, starting from the south entrance, there was 10 feet of snow on the ground. And so nothing can move around on the top of that. There's a few coyotes, some eagles flying around, a few chickadees, not much wildlife. It's full of wildlife in the other 3 seasons, but the wintertime they leave. They have sense enough to leave, unlike me. And so they, just trying to think, I had a mountain lion go right by my tarp one morning early, again, watching tracks. It was probably, she went by me maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes before I woke up. She didn't veer off at all. I'm sure saw me. I was right there in front of her. Followed her tracks for most of that day across Big Game Ridge, which was pretty cool. In some ways, it was kind of a spiritual experience. Traveling with other people is always good, it's fun, but the experience of just me and a mountain lion on top of Big Game Ridge, I mean, that's really cool opportunity to have. She lived there. I didn't live there, but at least I got a better sense of what her life, or his or her life, was like, traveling across the top of Big Game Ridge. And of course, I wasn't looking for a deer. I had jerky in my pack, but it sort of struck home the most. I was going up Harebell Creek on the west edge of Big Game Ridge, and I stopped for a snack in the middle of the day, and I'm standing there. You can't sit anywhere. Everything's covered with snow. So I'm standing there, my pack beside me, and I listen, and I hear this regular thumping sound. So I look around like, is there a tree falling here somewhere? And I listen again, and it was my heart. It was so quiet. My head had cleared out, and I could hear my heart beating. And the rest of the trip, in sleeping bag, just stop and hold my breath, and I hear my heart. I've done a lot of trips since with other people. There's just enough other noise, my own noise, whatever, too. My head never really cleared out. And so that was, it sort of felt to me like I was a part of this place. My heart was in kind of in tune with this silence of this place I was traveling in. And once I got further north, went around the lake, got to Fishing Bridge, and then started encountering some wildlife. There's less snow there. There's more thermal areas there where they'll spend the winter. And so I didn't really see much wildlife until I got towards Tower and the Lamar area, Blacktail Plateau. And it was full of wildlife because there's now maybe 2 feet of snow on the ground instead of 10. But the experience of seeing this country, the landscape was one thing, although 12 days of storms, a lot of times my visibility was less than 100 yards. So one of the questions I get is, don't you get lost out there? Well, I have a pretty good sense of direction. I mean, I know people who would get lost in a phone booth, but I have a good sense of direction. I'm not bragging. I just kind of know where it is. If I know where north is, I pretty much keep track of it all day. And so part of that trip, I'd never been on this country before, up the Snake River. I'd never been on top of Big Game Ridge, been in the thoroughfare. So the first probably almost third of this trip was new country to me. But I looked at maps. I don't carry a compass. Again, I have a good sense of direction. And I didn't carry maps because I just kind of memorized what I had to do. I had to go up Snake River. Once there's some bends there, and it's going to be Wolverine Creek and Harebell Creek coming in there. I go up the middle one, Harebell. And, but it's a challenge too, because in the wintertime, there are no trails. You got 10 feet of snow and everything. There are no trails. You cannot see them. You can't see the marks, the tags that the Park Service even puts on the trees for trails, because they're usually only about 6 or 7 feet off the ground. So they're buried too. And I like that challenge. I want, it's just me trying to negotiate this country, not as an adversarial situation. I don't feel wild country is an adversary at all. I feel wild country is a welcoming place. We evolved in wild country. My Norwegian ancestors were, fished in little little wooden boats out there in the ocean. And, the hunter-gatherers were not that many generations separated from them. And so I feel a better connection in wild country than I do in downtown New York City. I mean, that's
you mentioned that it's probably, to be truthful about, you were probably back in a more natural environment than being in a city. The city is actually unnatural. And
right.
It's fascinating how when you get out into the wilderness and after a few days, I think your body realizes, hey, this is where I'm supposed to be.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like I belong. The most honest thing I've ever encountered is nature. And there's some nature in Central Park or, little Sacagawea Park here in Livingston, Montana. But it's warped, I guess, for lack of a better word. There's stuff going on here that probably shouldn't in some ways. And so when I encounter the mountain lion on top of Big Game Ridge, he or she was not after me at all. I wasn't her prey. And I was curious, what route did she choose? It was fun to see where she went and kind of where I was going to go too. I mean, I'm not bragging, but when I'm traveling in country that I'm not familiar with, no maintained trails, if I'm on a wildlife trail, I know I'm in the right place because these generations of these animals have found the best routes. And if there's a wildlife trail, I'll take it because they know stuff that I don't if it's a new country to me. And so that honesty, I guess, is lack of a better word, is one of the things that attracts me. I just think I can learn a lot, and I do learn a lot from being out there.
Let me switch gears on you. You had a unique encounter with a polar bear, did you not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen them in Alaska and Canada and Norway. First place I saw them went up to Churchill, Manitoba, and the program there, I set up tours to take a dozen people up to photograph polar bears. And so we stay in this, what they call a bunkhouse arrangement, these weird, long, skinny trailers on big balloon tires way up off the ground, and these bunk beds and chemical toilets and whatever. And then we travel around in this tundra buggy, like a converted bus with giant, like 8-foot diameter balloon tires so they could drive through this bog. And so I had a bunch of people inside, and there's a propane stove to keep everybody warm. But the best place to photograph is out in the back deck. So the wind chill out there was about 30 below zero. And I was the only one out. Everybody else was inside. And so this was in the film days. So there's snow on the deck, and I'm standing on. And there was this one polar bear that I'd been watching. It was kind of aggressive. Most of them are curious about these big vehicles, whatever, and the smells coming out of them, but they don't pay much attention after a day or so. This guy kind of kept an eye on this buggy, and he'd be up out of sight under the buggy sometimes. And so polar bears make their living by hunting seals on the ice. they don't hunt on land much because they get overheated if they try to run something down. And so a few places they'll fish just like grizzly bears, but mostly they're out on the ice. So the way they catch their seals is they travel along, listen for the seals scratching through the ice to keep their breathing holes open. And so they breathe there, and they sometimes climb out of these holes, and they wait at this breathing holes real quietly until they hear this scratching sound, and then they might see the nose, and then bam, they smack this seal and pull them out of the hole to eat them. So anyway, so I'm in this back deck, and it's about 30 below zero. I change film, and I drop my roll of film because my fingers were numb. So I finished loading my camera, and then I reach down and scratch in this snow to find my roll of film, and bam, this bear smacks into the side of the buggy, trying to kill me, come break my neck through this little thin aluminum material on the side of the buggy. People come out and say, "What was that?" We just got hit by a polar bear who tried to kill me. I didn't fortunately break through it, but woke me up.
Now, Tom, I'm going to ask you a difficult question. What is your favorite photograph image that you've taken? One that maybe not necessarily is most popular, but to you personally is your favorite.
Well, that's a really tough question. I actually get asked that quite a lot. Can I give you 100 of them? So my answer basically is one that photographs that I feel that I give people a sense of who they are, not just what they are. That's not just a polar bear or a gorilla or whatever. It's who are they? In other words, some emotional connection. That's one of the reasons I like that mountain gorilla holding her baby. I mean, there's a lot of emotion in that photograph. So there's another one of a coyote I photographed in Lamar Valley, struggling along in this ground blizzard. I mean, it's probably 20, 25 mile an hour wind, just whipping through there and struggling along through this snow. I mean, that's part of this coyote's life. So I want to tell the story about who they are, what's their life like, and how do they interact with the landscape or each other or their prey or whatever. Probably the most popular photographs, which I really like, that sell well, are bison covered with frost. I teach photography and a lot of winter photography trips, and that's what everybody wants. They want a bison completely covered with frost. I say, well, I can find the bison for you, but you got to give me 30 below zero. Then we get frost. So there's a couple of my photographs that have sold really well. They're bison, either 30 below zero. One of them was 38 below zero when I photographed them. So to pick one, probably it would have to be one of my bison. I went to Brazil last August, I guess, and looking for jaguars, which were okay. I wasn't that entranced with jaguars. They're an impressive big cat, but the birds were terrific. So I spent a lot of time photographing birds. Some of them familiar to me, some of them I'd never seen before. But one morning we went out looking for anteaters, primarily nocturnal. I'm familiar with the normal anteater. They're about 3 feet tall, pretty big, skinny thing with a gigantic long nose. And found one of those and took off into the bushes. And then we found an animal I didn't even know existed. It's called an arboreal anteater. Little bitty guy, probably 30 pounds, has claws like a sloth, long claws to break these ant nests apart. They live in the trees. Just really cute. So I'm sort of surprised by that. It's not my favorite photograph, but I like learning stuff. And my learning there was this arboreal anteater. I didn't even know it existed. So that's cool. I mean, I'm ignorant about lots of things, but I try to be aware of what I potentially can find. And I didn't know they even were a possibility.
Well, that begs the question, what other unusual animals have you found and filmed?
Well, probably the rarest. Well, the mountain gorilla is really rare. They estimate there's less than 1,000 of them in the world. And there's lowland gorillas, which you see in zoos. But the mountain gorilla is longer haired, lives high elevation, like up around 10,000 feet, 8,000 to 10,000 feet in elevation. And so again, we knew they were there, hire a guide to take us in to see them. So one animal that I've always been intrigued about in Yellowstone is the wolverine. There's a group of animals called mustelids, mink, skunk, river otter, badgers, pine martens, weasels. There's all kinds of members of this family. And the wolverine has the reputation of being vicious and mean, which I hate that concept because the only creature I ever found that was vicious and mean was a human being. They're aggressive predators. They eat meat, and they got to kill them to eat them. So that's the way they make a living. And the wolverine has the strongest reputation, I guess, for being an aggressive hunter, partly because he's the biggest member of the weasel, the mustelid family. And so on my ski trips, I run into their tracks once in a while, and it's really intriguing. They're a pretty distinct track, and so I know they're around, but I've never seen one. But I was in Hayden Valley a couple of years ago along the Yellowstone River on a snow coach with a tour, and I thought looking out along the edge of the Yellowstone River, along the edge of the ice, I thought it looked like an otter. A river otter is related. And I turned and looked again, and it was a wolverine. It's like, whoa. I didn't even try to get my camera out. I wanted to see this thing. Again, my goal, I don't feel that animals are out there for my benefit. If I get a picture, great, but I'm not going to disrupt their lives and put them in jeopardy, whatever, just for a picture for me. If I can, I'll get a photograph. But I just jumped out of this snow coach almost before it stopped and ran over to the edge of the road. And of course, when it saw this coach, it took off running. So all I saw it was kind of going up into the trees. But that was a significant experience because there are three animals that I basically consider measures of wilderness, of wild country, at least in the mountains here. And that is a wolf, which have been reintroduced, as people may know, in 1995 and 96 after being gone for about 70 years. A grizzly bear, which used to be common all over the plains. It's a prairie animal primarily, forced up into the mountains. And there's about less than 1,000 of them in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Still a big thrill for me to see a grizzly bear and a wolf. The rarest and most elusive of all is a wolverine. And so it's just kind of it's heartening to know that they're still here. I bet they were on our ranch 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were there because they're very adaptable. They generally live at high elevation, so they may not have been on our ranch, but we had badger, like I said, and skunks and that sort of thing. So I'm kind of familiar with the mustelids, but this guy is kind of the pinnacle from my standpoint of a measure of wild country. So it's really cool to know they're there.
I had there's a photograph that was for me that I took that was a near miss. I was in Western Kenya in one of the last old growth forests there. And there's troops of Clovis monkeys up in the top of the canopy there. And it's hard to get close to them because as you move, then they're moving, through the tops of the trees. But I got this one photograph of Mother Clovis with its baby attached to her chest. And the baby's all white because it was pretty young. And I caught it in flight, this mother with the baby on her chest, going from branch to branch.
Wow, cool.
And almost because, the focus is just slightly off.
Yeah.
And it was one of those where you look at it and you go, everything, it's a 1 in a million shot. to even get the, because the canopy's thick, so you can't really get a good shot of him anyways. And I just happened to get him silhouetted, her between branches, full flight, baby on her chest, and it's just slightly out of focus, and there was nothing I can do. And I look at that photograph and I just start to cry. Almost.
Yeah. Well, I was in, first time I went to Africa, about 94, I guess it was. It was at Little Governor's Camp and along the Mara River. And you go out first in the dark for sunrise, and you're out there till maybe 11 o'clock, and the light's right above you, and it's terrible light, and you come back and take a nap and have lunch. Then you go back out about 3 o'clock till sunset. Well, we're in these canvas tents, permanent tents, and I noticed these young Maasai men are all carrying about a 16-inch chunk of rebar, iron chunk of rebar. And what in the world's that for? You're not going to whack a lion over the head with that. And until I found out about the third day, I was having lunch under this beautiful acacia tree, and the buffet, basically outdoors, was a lineup of salads and whatever. And so I had what I wanted, sitting at this table. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of people started yelling. And I look up, and here's these Maasai men flinging these chunks of rebar at this baboon who snuck in and had a lemon meringue pie in his hand, running, dodging rebar over this 6-foot-high fence. Last thing I saw was his arm with that lemon meringue pie. He never spilled a drop. I thought, you need to hire that guy as a waiter. He's really good. No pictures, but it was a great experience about what a baboon can do.
Oh yeah, they're all over this. In this little town of Baruti that I was at, assisting at a field medical clinic. But as we drove in, this one part of the little village, there's baboons everywhere. They're like cats all over the place, but they're just baboons just milling all around, and it was funny to see. For folks who are interested in learning and pursuing wildlife photography, what advice would you give them?
First advice I'd give them, pursue a career in wildlife photography. Don't give up your day job. It's tough to make a living at this. It's a lot of fun, absolutely a lot of fun. I encourage you to do it 100%. But it's really tough to make a living because part of the problem is lots of people want to do it. And with better technology, better equipment now, it's easier to get photographs that are reasonably good. So with that caveat, trying to make a living at it is one thing, but doing it for fun, I still do it for fun. So a couple of things. First one is you need to be comfortable outside in all kinds of weather. Cold, hot. I don't like hot very much, but I'll suffer if I have to. And be comfortable moving around in almost any kind of terrain. And not chase animals. It's counterproductive. If they realize you're after them, they're going to run faster. So you have to understand geomorphology, the shape of the land, what light's going to happen, what angles it's going to be in an hour or whatever, trying to anticipate behavior, which means you study animals a lot. I grew up studying cows, whether I wanted to or not. And so you try to anticipate what they might be doing, where they might go. And so I can sit on a hill, I've done it a lot, just watching a herd of bison, and I can tell people I'm working. I'm figuring out what they do, how do they interact with each other, what they might be doing next. So my analogy is, if you want to consistently get good photographs of a baseball game, you need to know the rules of baseball. Otherwise, you have no idea what they're doing out there, running around, chasing this little ball, where the stuff's going to happen. So understanding your animals is critical. And then the technology, It's actually a lot better now. In the film days, there's two main skills that you need to get really good with. And first one is exposure. In the film days, it was really hard. There's bracketing and all that stuff. If you missed it, why you kind of cover it with overexposed or underexposed with bracketing. Well, with wildlife photography, Murphy's Law, the best behavior was the one that was overexposed and you bracketed. I've operated on Murphy's luck, not Murphy's Law. I have pretty good luck, but with digital, you've got more forgiveness in that file now. So exposure is not as big a problem as it used to be. The ideal exposure is still important, but you can miss it some, whereas film days you couldn't. The other thing that's always going to be a problem is focus, and you mentioned that a bit ago. Autofocus is great. It's really fast, but you got to tell the camera what to focus on. Otherwise,
Right.
it'll focus on something you don't want, a stick over here or, whatever. So that's always going to be a problem, focus. So you need to be really aware of what the capabilities of your equipment are. And in terms of trying to make a living at it, I don't know how to do that. I'm still trying to figure out how to make a living at this. So I'm a lousy salesman. So I feel fairly comfortable that what the photographs that I put out there satisfy me in terms of illustrating these animals or the landscapes beauty. And if they're beautiful, then I think people will recognize that and find them valuable. And if they're valuable, then there's some pressure or some impetus to save that, make it something worthwhile, and that deserves our protection, our help, our consideration. So that's one of my goals as a photographer, is natural history photographer, is it's not about me, it's about what's in front of me. And if I can tell that story well, that's satisfying to me.
So that's the composition of the photo, right? Is you're composing the image, but you're composing that image for to tell a particular story. So how do you go about visualizing and composing that photograph?
Well, there's excuse me. Most people who talk about composition, which is critical. I mean, once you get past exposure and focus, the fun part and the most important part is composition. How do you place these elements of this story into a artificial frame, square, rectangular, whatever. So people talk about placing objects left to right, top to bottom, and that's really important. There's one thing called a rule of thirds. I hate the rule of thirds because it's too rigid. It says you should put something at one of these 4 points. My analysis is, if it looks good, it is good, wherever you put them. If it keeps a viewer's attention, my measure is for 5 seconds. People look at something uninterrupted and immersed in that image for 5 seconds. That's a successful photograph. You've got them walking around in that, trying to learn something. But so it's, again, left, right, top to bottom is important. But the third dimension, almost nobody talks about that. How do you create this illusion of 3 dimensions, depth and space and volume in a natural history environment? So I have my terms, my concept. There's 5 tools that I think about to create this illusion of depth and space. No particular order of importance, my terms. One of them we can create to a certain extent. The other 4 we have to find. The 4 that we have to find are a curved line that can create a sense of depth and space. One I call atmospheric haze, which is smoke or fog or smog or dust, or in other words, it's softer, hazier. It's on a different plane than something that's crisper and clearer. So you separate these things. A third one is color change, what I call color change. It could be texture change. You have 2 objects that are different colors. They feel like they're 2 objects, and there's this they're different planes. And then the fourth one is what I call relative size. So if you've got a bunch of bison or creatures of fairly uniform size, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. The smaller ones are further away. You don't think about this, but that's the illusion that you feel when you look at these photographs with depth. And then the fifth one is what I call relative focus, and that's depth of field. The aperture controls that. The same kind of thing. It sort of imitates the atmospheric haze concept. So typical photograph of mine and most wildlife photographs, the animal's sharp, the background's out of focus. So they pull away from the background. Too much depth of field, they smash together and they look like they're on the same plane and they get busy. So the two faults, I guess you'd say, for unsuccessful photographs are they're either not sharp, there's nothing that's sharp in them, and we have a tough time looking at something that's fuzzy everywhere. And then the second one is too busy. There's too much stuff going on there. So if you look at my style, in my photographs, they're generally very simple. Because I want to, focus down, concentrate on the main story I'm trying to tell. And I like, other elements, what's the landscape like where this creature is living its life. So the best and the most difficult wildlife photographs include a landscape. It can be a big landscape, it can be a little landscape, but I want this animal to be doing something, but where are they doing this? And it's not in a box in a zoo, it's out in wild country. So I'm always thinking about that when I'm walking along, skiing along. I'm always looking, can I get depth here? Is there something I can create this illusion of space and volume? And sometimes I find I've got great space and volume, but I don't have anything to put in it. Sometimes that's kind of frustrating. And then sometimes for wildlife stuff, for example, one of the problems, say, with mountain gorillas, it's in this profoundly busy jungle. So it's hard to pull this creature away from this busy background. So it's a challenge, and I like that. I like serendipity. I never know what I'm going to see out there. But if my mind's open to it and I'm ready to a certain extent, I've had pretty good luck.
Now, for folks who want to see your work and follow what you do, how would they go about doing it?
Well, I've got a website that I've had for about 25 years. So that's where you can see about 3,000 of my photographs if you want to waste a bunch of time there. And it's
wouldn't be a waste of time. What's the website name?
Website is T Murphy Wild. TMURPHYWILD.com. I have a Facebook page, but I don't pay much attention to that. A friend of mine set it up for me, and she did a great job. But I don't like computers, like I said a while back, and I'm just stuck on a computer more, and I don't want to be there. And I like every day. So if I was a good marketer and a good salesman, why, yeah, there's social media is a great place to promote your stuff. So that's basically the first thing I would recommend people do. Check out my website. I've published 12 books now. Most of them are available on my website. You can get them on eBay or wherever, Amazon, and then there's Christmas in Yellowstone is a film produced by Shane Moore, my friend, or Nature, PBS Nature. I think it was first aired like 19 years ago, and PBS people have told me that's the most popular film that Nature has ever produced. They've repeated that every Christmas for like 12 years, all over the world. I'd get emails from all over the world of people who saw that film, and two questions I got. One of them was, can I go out skiing with you? And I basically said, not no, but hell no. I don't know you. I don't want to be responsible for you if it gets down to 30 below zero and you're cold. I don't want to be responsible for that. And then the second one question I got was when I was a kid, I designed these sheepskin mittens, really, really warm mittens, even soaking wet. They're still warm because they're leather with the wool inside. And I still use them. So in this film, I pull these out of the pack and hold them up and say, these are the warmest mittens I've ever had. Stick them back in there. And people want to buy these mittens. And I don't make them anymore. I used to, when I was a kid, I sold them for $25. That's when I'd work for $1.50 an hour. And they insist they needed these mittens, and why wouldn't I sell them to them? So finally, I just said they're $500 a pair. And people quit calling me for that. My worry is somebody will order 100 pair, and I got to figure out how to make them, I guess. But, so it's
500 and 500 a pop. You could probably find a way.
Hire a bunch of high school kids. Yeah. So that's kind of a good exposure, I think, in a way to who I am, what I do, my winter photography at least. And then there's a film being finished now. Shane Moore, again, helps with that, and a woman out of Massachusetts, Allison Argo. And that'll probably be on PBS this fall or this winter. And it's a half-hour show about my philosophy and my photography in Yellowstone in the wintertime. So keep an eye out for that. I don't know if we have a name for it yet. I think we've had a couple of them. We haven't decided yet what the name of it is.
Look forward to seeing that. Well, Tom, this has been a great interview. Thank you for joining us. It's been very illuminating.
Thank you. It's great fun. I've got 1,000 stories, and most of them are true.
Yeah, you got to throw in a few yarns now and then just to keep everybody honest.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, so Tom, you be safe out there. But actually, before I let you go, what's your next project coming up?
A couple projects. This movie, trying to finish this film. I've got to be my 13th book, text primarily on my ski stories in Yellowstone Park. I've skied across the park 3 times and lots of other trips. So it's kind of not a how-to book, but skiing. How do you set up a camp? How do you cross streams? Whatever. So that's been a fun project. That'll be released this fall. It'll end up on my website. And then I'm going to be in Africa for 2 months, July and August. 2 of them are tours, photography tours, right? Teaching a group of people. And then the funnest part, new part for me is I love Kenya. You've been to Kenya. It's a beautiful place. And East Africa's spectacular landscapes. I'm going to spend 3 weeks on my own. And one of the places I'm going to visit is Tsavo. Have you been to Tsavo? That's more eastern Kenya. That's where the big elephants are, with the huge tusks still.
I haven't been there, but I've seen, film and so forth of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking for those. There's a lot of elephants in Botswana, and I'll spend some time in Botswana and Zambia, and lots of elephants there. But these are big bulls, so that'll be kind of fun. And everything, little birds to elephants.
Sounds exciting. All right. Well, you be safe out there, and we look forward to seeing these new projects.
Good.
So,
thank you, Mike.
All right.
Been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you on down the road.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhardt.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.